It begins in the quietest hours, when the wind presses against the shuttered windows of old Kentucky homesteads, and the past seems to breathe through the cracks in the floorboards. The Colt family, names whispered in unease by those who survived the edges of their influence, was said to be cursed before they even drew their first breath. There is a photograph, almost forgotten, tucked in a dusty archive in Louisville, showing a boy no older than 7, his eyes hollow as if he had seen the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders. Historians and local storytellers alike would later describe it as a photograph that should not exist, one that somehow captured the gaze of a soul already entangled in misfortune. Some say the image itself carries a chill, the kind that makes your skin crawl if you stare too long. But this is no mere superstition. The Colt legacy is written in the scars left on their descendants, in tragedies so specific, so cruel, they cannot be explained as random chance. And it is tempting to dismiss it as folklore, yet the evidence begins with the records. Birth dates that mirror deaths, letters in which fathers warn sons of an unnamed doom, and wills that forbid certain names from appearing in the family line. The Colt name, on paper, is tied to wealth and prominence, but beneath that veneer lies a different inheritance, one that is rarely spoken of outside hushed tones in courthouse basements or behind the doors of forgotten libraries. Every generation seems marked by a calamity, and always in ways that feel preordained. One child falls ill for no discernible reason, another vanishes for decades before reappearing under circumstances too bizarre to rationalize, and still another is consumed by the shadows of obsession or violence. The more you dig, the more it feels like the family itself is a trap, a living vessel of misfortune that cannot escape its own history. And some researchers trace the Colt misfortune back to the 1700s, to a man who immigrated to the colonies carrying not just ambition, but a secret so terrible it is difficult to pin down. His contemporaries spoke in coded letters and diaries about the mark of the bloodline, a phrase that crops up again and again, always in connection to deaths that came too early, fortunes squandered in the blink of an eye, and a relentless, almost magnetic pattern of despair. When the Revolutionary War rolled through, members of the Colt family were both celebrated and reviled, heroic by record, cursed in private correspondence. Soldiers who fought alongside them wrote home of strange premonitions, sudden illnesses, and inexplicable accidents. One account mentions a Colt who was said to hear voices at night, urging him to act in ways that would ruin him, though no one would ever see him speak of it openly. And what is perhaps most disturbing is how meticulously the pattern repeats. In one branch of the family, a line of boys, all firstborn, suffered mental illness so severe it drove 2 to suicide before the age of 30. In another, daughters born in late autumn were afflicted with debilitating accidents that left them permanently scarred. Their diaries documenting whispers that came from empty rooms, always speaking in the same cadence of voice that was part warning, part threat. Even the mundane tragedies, when placed side by side across generations, form a sequence too precise to ignore. In a single century, the Colt family lost more heirs than many prominent families did in wars, and yet the family never seemed to diminish entirely. It persisted, haunted and unbroken, as though the curse needed witnesses to endure. And you might wonder if this is all coincidence. Perhaps. Perhaps it is merely the dark imagination of those who catalog misfortune. But the records themselves, official and unofficial, show a pattern that defies randomness. Death certificates, court filings, and hospital logs, sometimes handwritten in spidery ink, often hidden in boxes that smell of mildew and decay, reveal anomalies that no modern explanation can fully resolve. There are mentions of children born with deformities that disappeared mysteriously by adolescence, or letters describing a sudden sickness that claimed multiple family members simultaneously, leaving outsiders baffled. And always, buried under these accounts, is a recurring sentence, a warning so vague that it would seem meaningless if taken out of context. The Colt bloodline cannot be spared, and this is where the story grows darker, where fact merges with something more sinister, almost imperceptible. Those who attempt to investigate the family closely, historians, genealogists, journalists, often report a creeping sensation of being watched. Doors that were locked appear open, notes that were in order become disorganized, and in one documented case, a photograph vanished entirely from a public archive, only to reappear years later in the hands of someone with no known connection to the family. It is as if the legacy itself resists exposure, bending reality around those who try to map it, to name it, to understand it. The deeper you look, the less certain you become of what is real and what is something else entirely, an echo, a shadow, a curse perhaps, that moves through the generations like smoke, intangible yet undeniably present. And yet, for all its horror, the Colt family persisted. They married, procreated, and sometimes thrived, but always under the watchful weight of that unseen force. Those who survived, if you can call them that, speak in hushed tones about family gatherings where someone inevitably falls ill, or where an argument will ignite without warning, leaving lasting scars. Their legacy is one of survival against a relentless and inexplicable tide. And tonight, as we dig into the hidden records, the letters, the photographs, and the whispered testimonies, we begin to understand something chilling. That to be born a Colt is not merely to inherit a name or fortune, but to inherit a story that may never end. A story written in suffering, silence, and shadows that stretch across centuries. And the early Colt homesteads were not just houses, they were fortresses of misfortune. Settled along misted rivers and dense Kentucky forests, the land itself seems almost complicit in the tragedies that unfolded upon it. Neighbors often described a heaviness in the air when passing the Colt estates, as though the very soil remembered each misdeed, each death, each whispered secret. And there were secrets always more than anyone could imagine. One of the earliest records tells of a Colt patriarch who, after returning from a business trip in the late 1700s, was found wandering the woods at dawn, speaking in a language no one recognized. By nightfall he was gone, only to be discovered days later in a distant county, disoriented, emaciated, and unable to recall his own name. A physician's notes survive, scribbled in a trembling hand, detailing a fevered mind and eyes that seemed to see things the living were never meant to see. He recovered partially, but the pattern had begun. And from that point forward, the Colt name became synonymous with sudden disappearances, inexplicable illnesses, and violent accidents. Diaries reveal the almost ritualistic nature of these misfortunes. One entry, written in 1832 by a Colt woman named Margaret, describes waking to the sound of her children crying in the middle of the night, only to find them unharmed but pale, their faces etched with terror. "They have seen it," she wrote, "something that waits in the corners, watching, always watching." Scholars who later examined her writing noted that the handwriting itself seemed to change between passages calm and flowing in the morning entries, chaotic and jagged after her encounters with whatever haunted her home. Margaret was not alone. Generation after generation, Colt family members recounted encounters with shadows that whispered, cold fingers tracing the backs of necks in empty rooms, fleeting shapes glimpsed from the corner of an eye. And one of the most chilling aspects of the Colt lineage is how the misfortunes are almost tailored. Each tragedy seems designed to hit its mark with precision. One son contracts a rare disease that no doctor can explain. A daughter suffers an accident that mirrors a death of her namesake from 2 generations prior. A father finds his life savings vanish under circumstances so peculiar that authorities suspect fraud, yet no perpetrator is ever identified. To modern eyes, these may appear as coincidences, yet when traced across centuries, they form a lattice of despair too deliberate to dismiss. The question becomes not whether the Colt family is cursed, but whether anyone could survive the weight of that inheritance at all. And letters discovered in private archives suggest that some members of the family were acutely aware of the pattern and attempted to break it. One particularly haunting correspondence from the late 1800s involves a Colt man who wrote to his brother, "I have tried to flee the mark, to live differently, but it follows me like a shadow I cannot escape. Even the land seems to conspire against me. If I am to die, let it not be forgotten." He was found dead 2 weeks later under circumstances so bizarre that the coroner could only write undetermined. No records indicate illness, no notes were left behind. Yet his last words, preserved in that letter, echo across generations. The curse is not a matter of superstition, it is the inheritance itself, tangible and unrelenting. And this inheritance is not limited to physical harm. Emotional and psychological scars appear with almost ritualistic regularity. Several Colt descendants were committed to asylums during the 19th century, their diaries preserved to this day. What strikes historians most is the similarity of their descriptions: voices that speak in tongues, rooms that shift and warp when no one is watching, and a pervasive sensation that reality itself is bending. One young woman, writing in 1891, describes waking to find her own reflection staring back at her with the face of an ancestor who had died decades before. Psychologists who have examined these writings caution that while trauma and hereditary mental illness may explain some cases, the repetition across generations, paired with the specificity of the events, is unusual, to say the least. And then there are the disappearances. Often these vanishings occur at moments of supposed triumph or stability. A Colt man will inherit a fortune, only to disappear for months, leaving behind letters hinting at voices guiding his steps into the unknown. A daughter poised to marry the man of her choosing will suddenly vanish from her own home, later found miles away in a state of near catatonia, muttering names long dead. Local law enforcement files, when cross-referenced with family journals, reveal a pattern. These events rarely leave evidence of foul play, yet they never happen without leaving permanent scars on property, on witnesses, on the survivors who carry the story forward. and by the early 20th century, the Colt name was both feared and scrutinized. Journalists occasionally tried to investigate, but most left the family circle terrified, reporting strange occurrences during interviews, lights flickering inexplicably, strange noises in the night, shadows moving against the grain of sunlight. Those who persisted often abandoned the project entirely, their notebooks filled with observations that made little sense on paper, but suggested something almost sentient in the family's misfortune. It was as if the curse itself was watching, correcting course whenever an outsider attempted to document it, ensuring that the Colt story remained shrouded in unease. And yet, despite the darkness, some Colt members persevered. They married, had children, and continued the lineage, unknowingly passing the pattern to the next generation. And in each of these lives, whether brief or long, the shadow lingered, a weight not seen, but felt. That is the essence of this family. Survival in the face of an inheritance that is more than wealth or name, survival under a shadow that stretches back centuries, wrapping its tendrils around each life, each home, each heartbeat. To understand the Colt legacy is to confront the unsettling possibility that misfortune can be inherited as surely as blue eyes or a crooked smile, and that sometimes no escape exists, only endurance. And by the mid-20th century, the Colt legacy had become a catalogue of quiet horrors, a family history that read like a ledger of despair. Local historians who dared to study it describe a pattern that is almost surgical in its cruelty, as though some invisible hand chose victims with precision. Children born into the line were often gifted, sometimes extraordinarily so, and yet the brilliance was always paired with inexplicable suffering. One descendant, a prodigious pianist in the 1940s, practiced tirelessly in an empty room, only to collapse mid-performance with a fever doctors could not explain. He survived, but the music never returned to his fingers. Letters found decades later suggest he believed the piano itself had been taken from him, that some part of his life had been stolen before he could claim it fully. And it is this recurring sense of something being stolen that pervades the Colt story. Beyond illness and accidents, there is loss that seems purposeful, targeted, almost conscious. Diaries and letters describe objects vanishing, jewelry, heirlooms, even personal manuscripts. One Colt woman writing in 1952 recalls a small wooden box containing family letters disappearing overnight, only to reappear years later in the home of someone she had never met. She writes, "I do not believe the world is so careless. I believe it is watching, choosing." And she is not alone in this feeling. Across time, Colt family members have reported the sensation of eyes on them when no one is present, of whispers in empty hallways, of cold drafts that move against the architecture of the home. Some psychologists have suggested these could be manifestations of inherited trauma, passed down like a silent disease, but the precision of the events defies simple explanation, and even the family's attempts to escape the pattern seem futile. In the 1960s, a young Colt couple relocated to the Pacific Northwest, hoping that distance would sever the curse. They arrived to a home overlooking the misty waters of Puget Sound, believing the isolation would bring safety. Within months, their son fell gravely ill, the illness undocumented in medical texts and resistant to treatment. Their daughter began speaking in voices no one else could hear, repeating phrases in archaic dialects that no historian could identify. By the end of the year, the family returned to Kentucky, fractured and fearful. Letters from that period are riddled with fear, suspicion, and a haunting resignation. "The blood will not let us go," one mother wrote, and there is also evidence that the Colt family was aware of the danger inherent in their own line. Private journals, hidden in attic chests, reveal that some members attempted protective rituals, ceremonial acts designed to ward off the misfortune. Candles burned at midnight, charms buried in the ground, prayers muttered under breath, but these efforts were largely ineffectual. In one 1920s diary, a Colt man writes of burying a locket at the corner of his estate to hold the shadow at bay, only for his child to fall into a coma weeks later. These failed protections, repeated across decades, underscore an uncomfortable truth: the curse does not discriminate, and it does not relent. It is indifferent to wealth, planning, or piety, and the psychological impact of living under such a legacy cannot be overstated. Several Colt members in the mid-20th century were institutionalized for conditions that modern researchers can only describe as extreme anxiety, paranoia, or hallucinations. Their writings, preserved in state archives, often blend reality and hallucination, creating a tapestry that is as disturbing as it is impossible to fully decode. One young man, confined in 1967, wrote, "I see the eyes in the walls. They follow me, but when I turn they vanish. I am not mad. I cannot be." Scholars have debated whether this is evidence of inherited mental illness or the tangible manifestation of the family curse itself. The argument, however, rarely reaches resolution, because the lived experiences of the Colts defy conventional understanding, and deaths within the family became equally enigmatic. Car accidents occurred at improbable moments and hair struck on an empty highway in broad daylight. A young woman drowning despite years of expertise swimming, a man falling from a staircase with no structural fault. Local newspapers often reported these tragedies with clinical detachment, unaware of the deeper pattern weaving through the family's lineage. One observer noted that by the 1970s, the Colt family name was associated less with social prominence and more with whispered stories of calamity. Neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives treated the family with a combination of awe and fear, a recognition that the Colts were marked in ways that were not merely metaphorical. And perhaps the most disturbing element of all is how the family itself internalized the curse. Letters indicate that members came to expect tragedy as a constant companion. Weddings, births, graduations, events that should have brought joy were instead suffused with dread. Parents would warn children of impending misfortune. Children grew to anticipate calamity as naturally as sunrise. In one 1955 letter, a father writes to his teenage son, "Do not trust happiness, it will not last. The bloodline remembers what you cannot see. It is patient but relentless." And that relentlessness, recorded over generations, gives the Colt family a story unlike any other, a chronicle of suffering so deeply ingrained it is almost institutionalized, a legacy that shapes identity itself, binding each generation in the same invisible chains as those before. And it is at this point in the narrative that we begin to see the true horror of the Colt legacy, not just the tragedies themselves, but the inevitability. No effort to escape, no relocation, no attempts at protection or secrecy ever seem sufficient. The curse is woven into the family's very being, as if written into their DNA, and the consequences of that inheritance extend beyond mere misfortune. They seep into identity, into perception, into the very way each member experiences the world. The Colt story is not one of random suffering. It is a study in predestination, an experiment in endurance, and a warning that some legacies are darker than money, more binding than law, and more merciless than time itself. And by the late 20th century, the Colt legacy had become almost a living document of dread, a chain of inexplicable events that stretched beyond the comprehension of ordinary observation. What's striking is the precision of misfortune, how it repeatedly targets not only individuals but their ambitions, their relationships, and their very sense of self. One particularly harrowing account involves a Colt woman born in 1948, named Eleanor. She was known for her intelligence, her sharp mind, and her quiet ambition to become a historian. Friends recall her as magnetic, with an almost otherworldly presence, yet letters she kept describe a persistent unease, a sensation that she was being observed by someone or something that no one else could perceive. Over the course of several years, she reported objects in her home moving on their own, fleeting shadows crossing the rooms, and whispers echoing from hallways that should have been silent. Her journals describe nights of insomnia in which she would wake to find every book she owned rearranged, often with passages highlighted in languages she did not understand. And what makes Eleanor's case particularly unsettling is how the disturbances escalated as she approached milestones of success. Her first published work, highly anticipated and meticulously prepared, disappeared the day before submission. Her engagement ended abruptly after a series of inexplicable events, phones that rang with no one on the line, letters shredded as if by unseen hands, doors opening and closing without cause. Friends and colleagues, when asked about Eleanor's experiences decades later, often smile nervously, reluctant to discuss them, as though the story itself carries a residual threat. She ultimately abandoned her career, leaving behind fragments of research that hint at a broader understanding of her family's dark heritage, a legacy she would not live to fully comprehend. And Eleanor's story is far from unique. Across the decades, the Colts experienced events that defy logic. Children vanish from rooms for hours, only to reappear with no memory of where they were. Adults suffer accidents that mimic historical tragedies within the family, creating an echo effect that is almost ritualistic. One 1972 incident involved a young Colt boy, Matthew, who was reportedly playing in the backyard when he simply disappeared for 3 days. His reappearance was as sudden as his disappearance. He was found wandering along a distant road, barefoot and disoriented, speaking in phrases from a diary belonging to a Colt ancestor who had died nearly a century earlier. Psychologists later examined the boy and found no indication of trauma or external influence, no abduction, no coercion, nothing to account for the precise nature of his return. It is a record that has haunted researchers, compelling them to ask questions about time, memory, and the inexplicable endurance of the Colt curse. And what gives the family's story its particularly haunting texture is the intersection of misfortune with ambition. Whenever a Colt seeks to rise beyond the shadow of their inheritance, the curse seems to manifest with brutal efficiency. One Colt man in the early 1980s inherited a small business from a distant relative. Within a year, the business was destroyed, not by bankruptcy, not by market collapse, but through a series of accidents that defy rational explanation: fires that broke out simultaneously in multiple locations, equipment failures that could not be traced to human error, and shipments lost in inexplicable circumstances. Journal entries suggest he began to fear the business itself had become a target, a proxy for his bloodline, and by the time he left the venture, he described feeling watched, judged, and condemned by something older than himself. And it is also worth noting the eerie recurrence of the same symbols and motifs across generations. Several descendants recorded seeing a crow outside their windows in the dead of night, always perched silently on the same branch. Some reported inexplicable scratches on furniture or floors, small and precise, often forming patterns reminiscent of letters or numbers that no one alive could decipher. Shadows seemed to follow the same arc across rooms, regardless of sunlight. Those who study these accounts often note that the repetition is unsettling, not merely because of the incidents themselves, but because they are identical in form, in timing, in sequence across decades. The curse does not merely act, it choreographs meticulously across generations. And then there is the question of awareness. Several cult members, particularly those coming of age in the 1960s and 1970s, became hyper-conscious of the pattern of suffering that defined their lives. Some attempted to leave the family entirely, cutting ties, changing names, or relocating to distant cities. Many report that despite their efforts, the legacy pursued them. One woman, born in 1959, changed her name, severed contact with relatives, and moved to the West Coast. Within months, her child developed a rare neurological condition, her partner lost employment under bizarre circumstances, and she received letters in the mail containing fragments of family histories she had never shared with anyone. It is a reminder that the cult curse, if it can be called that, is indifferent to geography, identity, or conscious avoidance. It is persistent, relentless, and for lack of a better term, aware. And by the late 20th century, the cult name carried a dual weight: outward respect and inward terror. Socially, they maintained appearances, marrying into other prominent families and cultivating the image of success. Privately, however, the weight of misfortune and inexplicable events created a psychological landscape more terrifying than any public scandal. Scholars and historians who have studied the line often note that the Colts do not merely live with tragedy, they anticipate it, plan for it, and, in some cases, come to internalize it as a defining aspect of identity. And it is in that anticipation, that constant dread, that the family's story becomes more than a collection of bizarre incidents. It becomes a blueprint for understanding how inherited trauma can manifest, how misfortune can crystallize into pattern, and how some legacies are simply too dark to escape. And as the calendar turned toward the 21st century, the cult legacy refused to fade. Modernity, technology, and rational thought did nothing to sever the pattern. If anything, the curse seemed to adapt, manifesting in subtler, yet no less cruel ways. Social media, once thought to be a bridge to anonymity, only magnified the uncanny events surrounding the family. One cult descendant, born in 1992, found their private online accounts repeatedly hacked, not by outsiders, but seemingly by forces beyond explanation. Posts would appear and disappear overnight, messages sent in languages no one in the family understood, often echoing phrases found in journals from decades prior. Attempts to delete or block these accounts proved futile. As one family letter put it, written on the eve of their 21st birthday, "Even the networks of men cannot hide us from the shadow." And perhaps the most tragic aspect of these modern experiences is the persistence of the same cycles of suffering in ways that mirror the past almost too precisely. Children continue to fall ill under mysterious circumstances. Heirs face accidents and disappearances that echo the patterns of their forebears. Careers, though modernized, are interrupted by inexplicable events. Jobs lost due to failures no one can trace, relationships destroyed by unaccountable circumstances, and personal achievements erased in moments that defy logic. Observers of the family, particularly distant relatives or historians, often describe a chilling sense of inevitability, as if every choice made by a cult is being measured against some invisible standard of doom. And yet there are also moments of eerie insight, evidence that some family members have come to recognize the breadth and depth of what they carry. One cult in the early 2000s wrote extensively about the patterns, attempting to map the tragedies of each generation like a historian of misfortune. The journals contain meticulous notes, timelines, and cross-references between accidents, disappearances, and illnesses. It is as though understanding the curse in itself was an attempt at survival. Knowledge is the only weapon, they wrote, but even knowledge trembles before what we inherit. These writings suggest a unique awareness within the family that this legacy is not merely a string of unfortunate events, but a living, breathing pattern that shapes the very way the world interacts with them. And one cannot explore the cult story without acknowledging the psychological burden on those who are aware. Anxiety, paranoia, and a profound sense of helplessness are common across the modern generations. Some have attempted therapy, medication, or complete isolation, but the feeling of being watched, of being influenced by something beyond their control, persists. It is in these accounts that the horror becomes almost existential, an understanding that the world itself conspires to remind them of the inheritance they cannot escape. Letters, digital messages, and private journals repeatedly reference a chilling refrain: "We live in a story written before us, one we cannot rewrite." And it is here, in these modern manifestations, that the pattern begins to feel almost sentient. Objects move with no human intervention. Voices are reported in empty houses. Shadows linger at the edges of vision. Even technology, something designed to bring control and predictability, bends to the same recurring motif. And in these moments, the question arises, is this merely a series of tragic coincidences, or has the Colt bloodline become a conduit for something far older, far darker, and incomprehensible? Some researchers who have studied the family report sleepless nights, as if the weight of the legacy itself presses against the edges of reason. Every generation leaves traces, and each trace seems to multiply in influence, ensuring that the pattern not only survives but thrives. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you flee? Would you fight it? Or would you resign yourself to the weight of a story you were born into, one older than your own life, yet shaping every moment? These questions linger not because the answers are simple, but because the Colt legacy, in all its darkness, forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that some inheritances cannot be escaped. Not wealth, not education, not willpower, only endurance and perhaps acceptance of the unseen forces that shape their existence. And even today, distant cousins report subtle but unmistakable echoes of the family curse. A young woman in 2018 described waking to the sound of piano music she had never learned to play. A man in 2020 recounted finding family letters he had never written, folded neatly atop his desk, containing warnings he could not understand. These are not isolated incidents, they are contemporary reflections of patterns that have persisted for centuries. Each generation witnesses the curse anew, and each attempts, in its own way, to navigate a world shaped by forces beyond comprehension. And so the story continues, threading itself into modern life. The Colt name still exists in the present day, carried by those who are painfully aware of the darkness in their lineage. They live, they endure, but they do so under the constant shadow of history repeating itself. Each misfortune, each accident, each strange occurrence is both a warning and a proof that the past, when it is as unrelenting as this, never truly releases its grip. The family story is a testament to endurance, yes, but also a cautionary chronicle of what it means to inherit something far heavier than fortune, a curse, alive and meticulous, shaped by generations, and impossible to outrun. And the deeper one digs into the Colt family, the harder it becomes to separate reality from something darker, something almost predatory. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the tragedies become sharper, more precise, and often more public, yet still shrouded in ambiguity. One particularly disturbing pattern is the recurrence of fatal accidents at pivotal moments in the lives of heirs. A Colt man, aged 28, was killed in 1997 when his car inexplicably swerved into a ravine. Witnesses described that the roads were empty, the weather clear, and yet the vehicle veered without cause. No mechanical failure was ever confirmed. His death mirrored the fate of his great-grandfather decades prior, who had died in almost the exact same circumstances on the same family route. Local newspapers reported it as an unfortunate coincidence. Historians studying the lineage see it as a pattern repeating with unnerving fidelity. And another haunting account involves a Colt woman, Jessica, who in 2004 was preparing to marry, her future seemingly bright and stable. A week before the wedding, she vanished. She was found 3 days later in a neighboring state, disoriented, speaking in a dialect no one in her family recognized. In her journal, she wrote of shadows that followed her from room to room, whispers that warned of the hand of blood, and visions of family members long deceased, beckoning her toward a darkness she could not resist. Psychologists concluded that trauma or a dissociative episode could explain her disappearance, but her recounting of events contained details that no outsider could have known: specific rooms, objects, and conversations that occurred in the homes of distant ancestors decades earlier, and the deaths themselves are equally disturbing in their precision. A young Colt man in 2011 drowned while swimming in a private lake, despite being a skilled swimmer. His mother, reading a diary from 1921, noticed the striking similarity. Another Colt had drowned under identical circumstances on a lake in the same region during the same season. Such repetitions are not isolated, they ripple through the family history. Accidents, illnesses, disappearances, and inexplicable events recur with almost ritualistic timing, creating the sense that each generation is a mirror of the last, caught in a cycle too precise to be random, but the most unsettling cases involve those who attempt to confront the curse directly. A Colt man in 1999, convinced that understanding the family's history could protect him, meticulously cataloged every accident, illness, and tragedy across centuries. He sought patterns hoping to predict when the next event might occur. Instead, he became a victim of the pattern itself. Objects in his home began to move unpredictably, shadows lingered where none should, and he experienced repeated physical injuries that defied explanation. By the end of the year, he had abandoned the home entirely, leaving behind his meticulous research. Notes recovered later suggested a chilling realization: the curse, if it could be called that, is not merely a sequence of tragedies. It is reactive, almost aware, shaping events to maintain itself. And what is perhaps most haunting is the interplay between life and death, ambition and misfortune. The Colts rarely perish without warning. The events often crescendo gradually, a slow tightening of circumstances that leaves no escape. A young heir may inherit wealth, only to see business ventures collapse in ways that mirror misfortunes faced by ancestors. A daughter may prepare for a career, only to experience illness or accidents that derail her ambitions, echoing the struggles of namesakes from decades prior. Even those who survive the most immediate dangers carry permanent marks, physical, emotional, or psychological, that testify to the persistent influence of the family legacy. And observers and historians have also noted a pattern of proximity. It is rarely the distant relatives who experience the tragedies. It is the immediate family, those most connected by blood, who bear the brunt. The curse, or the pattern, seems to favor direct inheritance, affecting those who are, in theory, best positioned to carry the family line forward. Yet it is merciless in its precision. Not a single generation escapes without some form of calamity. Scholars have referred to it as a chronicle of inevitability, a series of events that repeats like a carefully orchestrated cycle, as if the family itself is bound to the actions of its ancestors, and the consequences of those actions are still unfolding. And perhaps most unsettling of all are the voices that appear across generations. Several Colts have recorded auditory phenomena in diaries or journals, whispers in empty rooms, voices echoing conversations from long ago, and warnings uttered in languages that have otherwise vanished. In the modern era, these manifestations even extend to digital recordings, electronic devices capturing sounds that defy explanation, echoes of words that predate the devices themselves. The evidence suggests a continuity that surpasses ordinary misfortune, hinting at a family legacy that is not just unlucky, but almost sentient, actively shaping its own history. And so, the Colt legacy endures not in spite of modernity, but within it. The tragedies, strange occurrences, and psychological burdens continue to ripple through the family, leaving each generation a little more aware, a little more wary, and yet powerless to break the cycle. For those who study them, the lesson is clear: this is not merely a tale of bad luck. It is a story of inheritance in its most terrifying form, one that reaches beyond the tangible, beyond understanding, and into something older, deeper, and darker than any individual life. And as we reach the present day, the Colt legacy is no longer just a story of tragedy. It is a living archive of suffering, observation, and endurance. The family still exists, though now scattered, with members keenly aware of the patterns that have haunted their line for centuries. Some attempt to live ordinary lives, yet even the most mundane tasks are shadowed by echoes of the past. A simple family gathering can devolve into fear as children report seeing figures no one else can see, or adults recall dreams that bleed into reality, visions of long dead relatives warning, guiding, or simply watching. The weight of this inheritance is constant, a quiet pressure that shapes behavior, choices, and even relationships. And what makes the Colt story so chilling is not just the repeated misfortune, but the way it seems to encode itself into identity. The family is caught in a cycle of knowledge and dread. Each generation learns of the tragedies before them, and in doing so becomes complicit in the legacy simply by existing. Awareness is not protection, it is part of the inheritance. The older diaries and letters, meticulously preserved, read like warnings written in code impossible to ignore once discovered. One entry from 1912 reads simply, "To know is to be marked. To forget is impossible." Over a century later, the sentiment remains true. The Colt family is both witness and victim, their lives shaped by a narrative that began long before them, and that continues to assert itself with unyielding precision. And even modern historians and researchers who attempt to study the family report an almost oppressive sense of unease. Offices, libraries, and archives housing Colt documents often contain subtle anomalies, misplaced papers, cold drafts, fleeting shadows glimpsed in peripheral vision. Scholars describe nights of anxiety and unrest, a lingering sensation that the family's history cannot be fully contained or rationally analyzed. It is as if the legacy reaches beyond its own members, extending into the consciousness of anyone who seeks to observe it too closely. The curse, if it is one, has become a mirror, reflecting back on those who attempt to pry into it, a reminder that some histories are not meant to be fully understood, and the true horror, however, lies in the realization that the Colt pattern is not random, it is deliberate. Misfortunes repeat with eerie precision, accidents echo across generations, and tragedies are mirrored in details so exact they defy ordinary explanation. Scholars debate whether it is hereditary trauma, psychological inheritance, or something far older and more inexplicable. Yet the evidence persists unrelenting. Vanished children, sudden illnesses, accidents that mirror historical precedents, strange auditory phenomena, and objects that move without cause. Even in the modern era of science, technology, and rational explanation, the Colts remain ensnared, their lives echoing the meticulous suffering of their ancestors. And then there is the final, haunting implication: the Colt family may never be free. Each generation bears witness to the consequences of the past, carrying the legacy forward while attempting in vain to shape the future. Some attempt isolation, some attempt secrecy, some attempt to deny the patterns altogether, but the shadow persists. Letters, journals, photographs, and oral histories reveal a force that is patient, deliberate, and meticulous, ensuring that the story of the Colts continues to unfold exactly as it has for centuries. Survival is possible, but relief is not. Escape is an illusion, and as we step back and examine the totality of their history, one cannot help but feel a profound unease. The Colt family is more than a lineage, it is a living chronicle of inherited suffering, a testament to the persistence of misfortune, and a reminder that some patterns are so deeply embedded that no human intervention can sever them. Each tragedy is both unique and repetitive, a singular event echoing the history of those who came before. In the end, the Colts are not merely haunted, they are the embodiment of a legacy too dark to fully explain, a story that refuses to be forgotten, and a cautionary tale of the unseen burdens that can be passed from one generation to the next. And to witness the Colt story is to confront the unsettling possibility that some families inherit more than wealth, more than names. They inherit stories written in sorrow, shadows, and inexplicable loss. The legacy of the Colts is alive, persistent, and unyielding, reminding us that the past never truly dies, and that some truths buried in the soil of America's history are meant to remain hidden yet are impossible to fully escape. And perhaps that is the final, haunting lesson of this bloodline, that being born into a curse is not about a single misfortune, but about living under a weight that stretches across centuries, shaping lives, identities, and futures in ways no one could have predicted. And that will not relent, no matter how far the family flees or how hard they try to forget.